The morning at Whitmore Crest Tower began like any other Tuesday in early autumn, except that nothing about that Tuesday would end the way anyone in the building expected. By 6 o'clock, the marble floor of the main lobby had already been polished twice. By 7, the security team had been briefed 3 times. By 8, the reception desk had been told to smile harder, stand straighter, and forget any complaint they had ever filed. It was the day the investors were coming. Whitmore Crest Group, a commercial real estate firm whose name had grown larger than the people who built it, was hours away from signing the largest merger in the company's history. Every detail had been rehearsed, every uniform pressed, every camera checked. In the middle of all that polish, an old janitor named George Harlan was pushing a cleaning cart along the edge of the lobby, doing his work the way he had done it for the past 3 months, quietly, patiently, and almost invisibly. The accident took only a second. A mid-level manager moving too fast clipped the corner of the cart with his briefcase. The yellow bucket tilted. A long sheet of soapy water slid across the marble. George dropped to one knee at once. He pulled a clean rag from the cart, pressed his palm to the floor, and began to soak up the spill before anyone could slip. He did not look up. He did not complain. He whispered an apology to no one in particular, because that was simply the way he had been raised. He did not know that Scarlett Whitmore had just stepped out of the executive elevator. She froze the moment her heels hit the marble. The sound of her steps stopped, and the sudden silence pulled every face in the lobby toward her. She wore a cream-colored dress with a soft V neckline, her dark brown hair falling loose past her shoulders, her watch catching the chandelier light, her expression smooth and perfectly composed for an audience she had been preparing to impress all week. Then she looked down at the wet floor, and at the old man on his knees, and something in her face changed in a way that everyone who saw it would remember for the rest of the day. She did not ask if anyone had slipped. She did not ask whose briefcase had hit the cart. She did not ask whether the older man had been hurt. She looked only at his worn black shoes, at the faded gray of his uniform, at the way his shoulders curved gently from years of bending. When she spoke, her voice was calm, and that calmness was somehow worse than anger. "If you cannot keep a floor clean for 5 minutes," she said, "perhaps you should not be standing in this building." George lowered his head a little further. He said nothing. She let the silence stretch. "Shoes like those," she added, "should not appear in front of investors." In the corner of the lobby, behind a tall potted fern, a man named Logan Bennett was holding the small hand of a 6-year-old girl who had just whispered the first honest question of the day. Logan Bennett was 29 years old, 6'2", with the kind of frame a person earned by spending a decade crawling through service tunnels and climbing onto rooftops rather than sitting under a gym light. His brown hair was cut short and slightly uneven, the way it always looked when he tried to do it himself between shifts. His eyes were a quiet blue-gray. His hands were broad, with 2 small white scars on his right knuckles from a wiring panel that had bitten him 3 years ago. He had not planned to bring his daughter to work that morning. Chloe's elementary school had sent out a message at 5:45 about a burst pipe in the basement. Classes were canceled. His sister, who normally watched Chloe in emergencies, had a doctor's appointment she could not move. So Logan had buttoned the small navy coat over Chloe's shoulders, brushed her hair back with a damp comb, and explained that today she would have to be very, very quiet at the building where Daddy fixed the alarms. She had nodded with the seriousness of a child who took every promise like a small contract. She brought her stuffed bear, Milo, whose left ear had been resewn so many times that it now sat slightly crooked, and she held Logan's hand the whole way across the parking garage. Logan had been a contract safety technician at Whitmore Crest Tower for 8 months. He checked smoke detectors, sprinkler valves, backup generators, and the electrical panels that fed the service elevators. His hourly rate was decent but unguaranteed. The contract was renewed month by month, and roughly 40% of his monthly income passed through this single building. 3 years ago, after his wife left without explanation and without a forwarding address, he had walked away from a steady position at a larger firm because contract work let him pick Chloe up from school. Some months it meant choosing between a transmission repair and a new winter coat. He had never told Chloe about the trade-off. His own father had been a maintenance man at a small parts plant in Joliet. Logan remembered standing in a doorway at age 7, watching a younger supervisor mock his father in front of a row of workers for the dust on his work shirt. He remembered the silence around the older men. He remembered the way his father had said nothing, only looked at the floor, only kept his hands in his pockets so no one would see them shaking. That memory had shaped 3 quiet rules that Logan tried to live by. Do not look down on people who do honest work. Do not laugh when another person is being shamed. Do not let the fear of losing something become an excuse for staying silent in front of something wrong. That morning, in the lobby of Whitmore Crest Tower, all 3 rules were about to be tested at once. Scarlett Whitmore was 28 years old, and she had spent the last 2 years building a reputation that did not allow her to be soft. She had been promoted to interim chief executive officer of Whitmore Crest Group during a quarter when the firm's largest property had nearly defaulted, and she had pulled the company out of that hole with a discipline that the board had not expected from someone her age. After the rescue, the interim title had quietly become permanent. She was beautiful, and she knew the way other people used that word. She had heard it whispered in the elevator and written into trade articles and used against her in negotiations. She had learned early that for a young woman in a room full of older men, beauty without sharpness was a liability. So she had become very, very sharp. Her brown hair fell long and loose because she had decided long ago that pulling it back tightly made her look younger, and looking younger made the board treat her like an assistant. Her dresses were always tailored, the cream V neckline of that morning chosen because it photographed well against the lobby marble. Every choice she made about her appearance was calculated, and that calculation had become a kind of armor. She did not believe she was cruel. She believed she was efficient. Cruelty, in her view, was personal. Efficiency was professional. If a low-level worker was no longer useful to the company's image, that was a question of operations, not feelings. If a janitor stood in the wrong place at the wrong time, that was a failure of management, and management was something she had been trained to correct in public so that the correction would be remembered. That morning, with the investor delegation arriving in less than 90 minutes, Scarlett had walked into the lobby, determined to demonstrate one thing above all others. She controlled every detail of this company, every floor, every employee, every breath. And in her certainty about that control, she had not noticed that the old man with the wet rag was watching her face the way a teacher watches a student during a final exam. The lobby had grown unnaturally quiet. People kept moving, but their movements had become careful, the way water moves around a stone. 2 receptionists at the long black glass desk pretended to type. A security guard near the revolving door pretended to read the visitor log. None of them looked at George. None of them looked at Scarlett. None of them looked at each other. Scarlett raised one finger, not high, just enough to summon someone, and Amanda Collins appeared from the corridor that led to the human resources floor. Amanda was about 40, with shoulder-length brown hair pinned neatly back, a charcoal blazer over a pale blouse, and the kind of brisk walk that had been taught to her at her first office job and never abandoned. She carried a tablet in both hands like a small shield. "His name," Scarlett said quietly. Amanda glanced at George, who was still kneeling. "His name, please," Scarlett repeated. "I am sure he has one." George straightened slowly, the way a person does when his knee has been on a cold floor for too long. "George Harlan," he said. His voice was steady. He gave the name as though he had not just been told that his shoes were unfit for the building he was cleaning. Amanda tapped the tablet. "He is contracted through Premier Facility Services," she read. "Started 91 days ago. Day shift. No incidents on file." Scarlett nodded once. Suspend him after the morning shift, she said. I do not want investors seeing this kind of employee in the building. A small breath escaped from somewhere near the reception desk. George did not protest. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Scarlett for a moment, the way a person looks at a window during a storm, and then said something that was almost worse than any defense he could have made. I still have 3 floors left to clean, he said. It was such a small sentence. It was the sentence of a man who had spent his life thinking of the work first and himself second. It made the lobby feel very, very cold. Scarlett's mouth tightened. You should be more concerned with whether you will be allowed inside this building this afternoon. 2 other cleaners, a younger man and a middle-aged woman in matching gray uniforms, had paused near the service corridor. Their faces went pale, and they exchanged the kind of look that 2 co-workers exchange when they realize the rules of the workplace have just changed. If a janitor could be suspended over a wet floor, then any of them could be removed for any reason at any moment. They lowered their heads and slipped through the corridor door, hoping no one had seen them notice. Chloe had not moved from her father's side, but her grip on his hand had tightened. She was small for 6, with light brown hair pulled into a half-up style that her father had not quite managed to make even, and large gray eyes that took in more than children were supposed to be able to take in. She watched George's old hands as they wiped the marble. She watched the small tremor in his fingers. She watched the way he refused to look up at the woman in the cream dress. She did not understand contracts, or investors, or mergers, or the careful arithmetic of fear that the adults around her were performing. She understood only what she could see. She tugged her father's sleeve and tilted her head back so she could whisper toward his ear. "Dad," she said. "Why is she talking to him like he isn't a person?" Logan did not answer right away. He felt the question land in the center of his chest with a weight he had not been prepared for. He looked down at his daughter, at the slightly crooked half ponytail, at the small wet streak on her coat sleeve where she had wiped her nose on the walk-in, at the corner of Milo the bear poking out of the crook of her elbow. He thought of his father in that factory doorway. He thought of his own younger self, watching and being unable to do anything. He thought of the years that had followed, and of all the small ways he had built his life so his daughter would never have to look at him and feel that same helpless shame. Chloe tugged again. "If nobody helps him," she whispered, "is it because he is poor?" Logan closed his eyes for half a second. He weighed the morning very quickly. He weighed the rent he owed at the end of the month. He weighed Chloe's tuition at the small kindergarten where she had finally started making friends. He weighed the dental work she would need in the spring and the medical insurance premium that climbed every quarter without explanation. He weighed every dollar this building paid him. Then he weighed the cost of doing nothing in front of his daughter. The 2 columns of arithmetic were not close. He bent down gently until he was at Chloe's height. He took her small chin in his hand the way he did when he wanted her to look at him and remember something. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "Stay close. Whatever happens, do not let go of Milo." Chloe nodded once, very serious. Logan stood up. He did not square his shoulders, because he was not a man who needed a stance to find his courage. He simply stepped forward into the line of Scarlett Whitmore's polished attention. "He already apologized," Logan said. The lobby seemed to lean in. Scarlett turned, slowly, the way a chief executive turns when she is choosing whether to dignify an interruption with a full response. Her eyes traveled down Logan in a quick expert assessment. She noted the faded cuff of his work jacket, the scuffed toe of his left boot, the contractor's badge clipped to his belt rather than to a corporate lanyard. She noted that the woman beside him was a child, and that the child was holding a bear. "Excuse me?" she said. "He already apologized," Logan repeated, evenly. A small mistake does not need to become a public humiliation. A young woman near the reception desk pressed her lips together very hard. Scarlett tilted her head, the way a teacher tilts her head at a student who has spoken out of turn. "And which department do you work in exactly?" "Safety systems," Logan said. "I am the technician on the 12th floor today," Contracted through Bennett Systems Maintenance. Ah. She smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Then perhaps you should go check a circuit breaker, instead of teaching me how to run my company. Logan did not look away. Running a company, he said, does not give a person the right to humiliate someone who cannot defend themselves. Several investors who had just stepped out of the side conference room paused in the corridor. A gray-haired man in a charcoal suit, the most senior of them, slowed his stride. He had not been told about a confrontation. He had been told that the lobby would be perfect. Scarlett felt the change in temperature in the room as physically as a draft from an open door. She had built her career on never being challenged in public, and she had certainly never been challenged by a man wearing a contractor's badge. "You think you are more moral than I am," she said, "because you spoke up for a man with a mop." "No," Logan said. "I think that if a 6-year-old can see this is wrong, then the adults in the room should not pretend they cannot." The silence that followed was the kind that does not get filled by anyone. Chloe, still holding Milo, looked up at her father with the half-frightened, half-proud look of a child who realizes that the man she lives with is also a man other people are looking at. George, kneeling beside his cart, lifted his head for the first time. He did not look at Scarlett. He looked at Logan. There was something quiet and old and considering in his face, as though he had just seen a thing he had been looking for in this building for 3 months without knowing exactly what it was. Scarlett took a slow breath. She was used to opponents who tried to match her sharpness. This man had not raised his voice. He had not insulted her. He had not even moved. He had only stated a fact in front of her own employees, and her own employees were now staring at the floor in the way employees stare when they are silently agreeing with something they would never dare to say aloud. That made her angry. Anger, she had learned long ago, was the most expensive emotion a chief executive could allow herself in public. She tried to push it back down. It did not quite go. "What is your name?" she asked Logan. "Logan Bennett. And the child is yours. Yes, then you should know better." Scarlett turned to Amanda Collins, who was still holding her tablet with both hands. "What firm did you say his contract was through?" "Bennett Systems Maintenance," Amanda said, reading from the tablet. "Subcontracted under our facility's umbrella. Month-to-month renewal. 48 days remaining on the current cycle." 48 days, Scarlett repeated, as though tasting the number. "That is generous." She turned back to Logan. Her voice was no longer cold. It was something harder than cold. It was the voice she used when she wanted to be sure that the room remembered what had been done to whoever stood opposite her. "I want a notice on my desk by noon," she told Amanda, loudly enough that the investors in the corridor could not miss it. "Mr. Bennett's contract is under review for unprofessional conduct in a restricted area. I will also be calling our network of partner property managers personally. There are about 30 buildings in this city where a contractor like him might hope to find a renewal. I would like all 30 to know what happened here this morning." Chloe made a small sound. It was not a word. It was the smaller, sharper kind of sound a child makes when she begins to understand that her parent is being attacked, and she does not know how to stop it. She tugged on Logan's hand. "Dad," she whispered. "Daddy, let us go." For a moment, the entire lobby waited. Logan could feel the math of his life rearranging in real time. He could feel the rent, the kindergarten tuition, the dental work, the insurance premium, all of them tilting slightly toward an edge. He could feel his daughter's small hand sweating into his palm. He could feel the look that the investors were giving him, which was the look strangers give when they are deciding whether to remember a face. He did not let go of Chloe's hand. Scarlett took one step closer. She was perhaps 8 inches shorter than him, and yet at that distance she somehow occupied more space than he did. She lowered her voice so that only the closest people could hear. "A wise father," she said, "would not trade his daughter's rent money to defend a man who mops floors." It was the second sentence of that morning that the lobby would remember. Logan felt the heat rise behind his ribs, and he did not let it show. He bent down slowly until he was at Chloe's height. He placed one hand gently on the back of her head. He whispered something to her that no one else could hear, and then he kissed her forehead, and then he stood back up. He looked at Scarlett the way a man looks at a door that is just locked behind him. "A father is worse," he said, "if he teaches his daughter that the food on the table matters more than another person's dignity." The lobby did not breathe for several seconds. Scarlett did not respond. She could not, immediately. She had used the child as a lever, and the lever had broken in her hand. She could feel Amanda Collins's eyes flick toward her. She could feel the senior investor's posture stiffen in the corridor behind her. She could feel something shift in the room, very subtly, away from her. She did not know yet that the worst shift had already happened 20 feet behind her, where George Harlan had quietly set the handle of his mop against the side of the cart and risen to his full height. George did not look like a man about to confront anyone. He looked exactly like what he had been pretending to be for 91 days. He wore the gray uniform of Premier Facility Services. His shoes were old. His hands carried the calluses that come from holding tools for 40 years. But the way he stood now was different. He was not stooped any longer. He was not staring at the floor. He looked at the lobby the way a man looks at a house he built decades ago. He looked at the marble, and at the chandeliers, and at the brass plate above the security desk that read Whitmore Crest Tower, and his eyes behind the cheap reading glasses he wore over the bridge of his nose were tired but very, very clear. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Scarlett turned. She had almost forgotten about him. That, in itself, was its own kind of mistake. "Miss Whitmore," George said again, gently, "do you know who used to clean this floor before this building was called Whitmore Crest? I do not have time." The simplicity of the sentence stopped her. George turned, slowly, until he was facing the corridor where the investors were standing. His eyes found Patrick Hayes, the chief legal counsel of Whitmore Crest Group, who had been hovering in the back of the investor group, hoping not to be noticed. Patrick was a tall man in his early 50s, with silver at his temples and a habit of carrying 2 pens in his breast pocket. He had been employed by the company for 19 years. "Patrick," George said. He said it the way an old man says the name of a younger man he has known since the younger man was 23. Patrick Hayes went very still. George reached into the upper pocket of his uniform, the one that most cleaners use for a small notebook or a packet of cleaning wipes, and he pulled out a thin piece of metal, smaller than a credit card, slightly tarnished at the edges. He held it loosely between 2 fingers, the way a man holds something he has been carrying for a long time without thinking about it. The metal card had a single symbol etched into its face. A capital letter H, set inside the shape of a tower. Patrick saw the card, and the color drained out of his face in a way that no one in the lobby would forget. He had not seen that emblem on a card in nearly 20 years. Scarlett saw the card too, but she did not recognize it. She turned to Patrick. "What is that?" Patrick swallowed. He looked at Scarlett. He looked at the senior investor in the corridor. He looked at George, who was watching him with a patience that was now almost terrifying. "That is a founder's card," Patrick said quietly. Scarlett's hand, almost imperceptibly, tightened around her phone. A founder's card in the original Harlan Properties had been a quiet ritual from the company's earliest years. In the early 1980s, when the firm was 3 borrowed rooms above a bakery in the West Loop, George Harlan and 2 partners had each carried a small etched piece of metal with the company's first emblem on it. When the firm had grown, and then absorbed 2 other property holdings and emerged under a new name, the founders' cards had been retired. Only 3 had ever been produced. George had kept his in a drawer in the back of his desk for 26 years. He had taken it out of that drawer 3 months ago, on the morning he had decided to walk into a different building under a different name. Patrick Hayes, his voice steadier than his face, began to explain to Scarlett in front of the senior investor what he could not refuse to explain. George Harlan had been the original founder of Harlan Properties, the firm that, after a merger 14 years earlier, had become Whitmore Crest Group. After his wife had died of a long illness, George had stepped away from the public side of the business. The press releases had described it as semi-retirement. The board had been quietly informed that he wished to keep his name off all public materials. His photograph had been removed from the corporate website. The new generation of executives had inherited a company whose origin had been quietly folded into a footnote. But the Harlan Family Trust, which held nearly 41% of voting equity in Whitmore Crest Group, had never changed hands. And the trust had only one living principal beneficiary. The man currently standing in a gray janitor's uniform in the middle of the lobby. He had not come back for a ceremony. He had come back 3 months ago, after a letter had arrived at his home in Evanston. The letter was handwritten, from a woman named Margaret Doyle, who had worked as a cleaner at Whitmore Crest Tower for 18 years before being pushed into early retirement when her hourly wage had become inconvenient. Margaret had written that the company George Harlan had built had stopped seeing the people who kept it clean. George had not trusted the company to investigate itself. He had applied to Premier Facility Services through an old name from a long-closed property in Joliet. He had been hired without a second glance. He had been pushing his cart through the building's lower floors for 91 days. George turned now to Scarlett. "You think I made this floor dirty?" he said quietly. His voice was not loud, but every word reached every corner of the lobby. "You are mistaken. The thing that makes this floor dirty is not water. It is the way you spoke just now to a man you believed had no power to answer back." Scarlett tried to speak. Nothing came. "I cleaned this floor myself," George continued, "when this company had 12 employees and 1 office. I did not build it so that the person at the top could use the chief executive's chair as a whip across the backs of the people who do the work." The senior investor in the corridor, whose name was Daniel Reeves, and whose firm controlled approximately $180 million of the proposed merger, was no longer pretending to read his phone. He had quietly tucked it into his pocket. He had stepped forward exactly half a pace. The 2 younger associates behind him had stopped breathing in the visible way that younger associates do when they realize they are about to witness a defining moment in their professional education. Within 20 minutes, the lobby had been cleared of all non-essential personnel. Within 40 minutes, an emergency session of the executive committee had been called to the conference room on the 48th floor. Patrick Hayes had been instructed, by George Harlan himself, to bring the most recent voting trust documents and the founder's charter from the original incorporation file. Amanda Collins had been asked to pull every personnel change for the lower-tier service staff over the past 16 months. Scarlett walked into that conference room, not as the chief executive officer who had ordered breakfast for the investors that morning, but as a woman whose entire understanding of the room had just been overturned. Logan tried to leave. Chloe was tired and frightened, and had begun to cry in the small, silent way that children cry when they do not want to be noticed. He picked her up. He told the security guard at the side exit that he was taking his daughter home. The guard, who had been watching the lobby in silence the entire time, nodded and held the door for him. George stopped Logan at the elevator. "Stay," he said. "Just for the meeting. As a witness. If you cannot stay for me, stay for the people in this building whose names neither one of us knows yet." Logan looked at Chloe. Chloe looked at George. George smiled, gently, in the way an older man smiles at a child who has been brave enough already. Logan stayed. The conference room on the 48th floor had a long table of dark walnut, 12 chairs upholstered in charcoal leather, and a view of the lake that on most days was the most expensive thing in the building. That morning, the view was beside the point. George Harlan sat at the head of the table, in the chair that Scarlett had always sat in. Scarlett sat 3 seats to his right. She did not cross her arms. She did not lean back. She did not perform. She had spent the past hour understanding that no performance she had ever rehearsed would work in this room. Patrick Hayes, with a voice that did not shake, but did not pretend to be steady either, laid out the basic facts. The Harlan Family Trust held 41% of voting equity. Under the original charter, that share, combined with the founder's moral oversight clause, was sufficient to call for the suspension of any sitting officer pending an independent review of conduct. The suspension did not require a vote. It required only a written declaration from the principal beneficiary of the trust. That declaration, Patrick said, had been signed at 7:45 that morning. George had carried it in his other pocket. Scarlett read it without expression. She did not argue. She had, somewhere on the elevator ride up, made the small and important decision not to be a person who argues with what is true. George opened a manila folder. Inside were 91 days of small things. A staffing schedule that showed the night cleaning team had been cut from 6 members to 4, while the floor count had been increased by 2. An internal email from a mid-level director, sent to Amanda Collins, requesting the removal of any uniformed staff whose appearance did not align with the company's premium image during investor tours. A grievance form from a security guard named Marcus Allen, age 61, who had requested a chair for his post and had been told by his shift manager that the chair would create the appearance of laziness. A list of 7 long-term contractors whose rates had been reduced under the threat of replacement. George did not raise his voice once. He read from each document in the calm, slightly slow way an older man reads when he wants to make sure his hands do not shake. When he finished, he closed the folder. The proposed merger, the investors confirmed quietly in the corridor outside the conference room, would need to be paused. Not killed. Paused. The phrase used among themselves was cultural risk assessment, which is the phrase financial people use when they have remembered, briefly, that the value of a company is not entirely separate from the way the company treats the people who clean its floors. Scarlett was suspended from her duties as chief executive officer effective immediately, pending a full independent review. Amanda Collins was placed on administrative leave while her records were audited. 2 mid-level directors who had signed the most aggressive cost reduction memos were placed under separate review. Logan was offered a role he had not asked for. The title was Director of Building Integrity and Safety Culture, a position created that afternoon to bridge the technical safety teams and the frontline service staff. The salary was modest by executive standards and life-changing by his. He asked for one night to think about it. George did not press him. 3 weeks later, the lobby of Whitmore Crest Tower looked almost the same as it had on the morning of the spill. The marble was still polished. The chandeliers still threw their cold, clean light across the entryway. The reception desk still held its black glass surface. What had changed was harder to see, but a person who paid attention could find it. The night cleaning team was back to 6 members. Marcus Allen had a chair at his post, and the chair had not lowered the dignity of the security uniform in any visible way. The contractor rate schedule had been restored. A small plaque had been mounted above the service corridor door, a plaque that nobody had been told to read but that Logan walked past every morning. It read in plain serif type, "No honest work is invisible." Logan had taken the new role. He still did most of his rounds himself. He still checked the smoke detectors on the 12th floor every Wednesday, the way he had checked them for the past 8 months. The difference was that when he spoke now, in meetings and in hallways, the people around him listened in a way they had not listened before. He did not enjoy the change in volume. He simply tried to use it well. Chloe was in the lobby that Friday afternoon. School had let out early for a teacher-in-service day, and Logan had brought her in to meet some of the people he had been talking about at home. She wore a small purple raincoat and held Milo by his slightly crooked ear. She was looking for George. She found him near the south elevator, with a soft cloth in one hand, polishing a smudge off the brass call plate. "Mr. Harlan," Chloe said, "you do not have to do that anymore." George smiled at her without lifting his head. "No," he agreed. "But I like to. It reminds me where everything started." Scarlett walked through the lobby a few minutes later. She did not have an entourage. She did not have a tablet. She did not have the cream V-neck dress. She wore a charcoal sweater, simple slacks and flat shoes. She had been required by the board to complete an executive conduct review program before any decision about her future would be made, and the program had asked her more than once to come back to this building during the workday and walk through the lobby. The point of the exercise was not punishment. The point was attention. She saw George first. She crossed to him directly. She did not begin with an excuse. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "I owe you an apology. I would like to give it without conditions. I used the power of my position to make a man smaller in front of other people because I was afraid that if I did not, the people watching would think I was weak. That was not your problem. I made it your problem. I am sorry." George listened. He did not interrupt. When she had finished, he set the polishing cloth down on the lip of his cart. "I do not need you to feel ashamed for one day," he said quietly. "I need you to change the way you look at people for the rest of your life." Scarlett nodded. She did not try to defend herself. She turned to Logan next. Logan, who had been standing a few steps back with one hand on Chloe's shoulder, met her eyes. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I threatened your livelihood in front of your daughter to make a point. I did not understand what it cost a parent to be used that way. I am sorry." Logan looked at her for a long moment. He did not soften his face. He did not harden it either. "I do not need you to apologize to me as much as I need you to remember this," he said. "The next time you see a person who has no power standing in front of you, remember that they are still a person." Scarlett nodded again. Finally, slowly, she knelt down so that she was at Chloe's height. She had never knelt for anyone in this lobby. The marble was cold through the fabric of her slacks. "I am sorry," she said, "that you had to watch a grown-up be unkind." Chloe looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into the small front pocket of her raincoat and pulled out something she had been saving for school the next morning. It was a small foil star, the kind teachers give out for good behavior. She turned, very carefully, and pressed it onto the front of George's gray uniform pocket. "You are not a stain," she said to him. "You are the man who makes this place clean." George's eyes filled. He did not let the tears fall, but he did not blink them away either. Logan put a hand on Chloe's shoulder. Scarlett, still on her knees, stayed silent. A few feet away, a young janitor pushing a cart down the corridor was greeted by a passing manager who, for the first time in months, said good morning by name. A security guard held the door for a courier, and then turned and helped another cleaner roll a heavy bin over the lip of the rug. They were the small, ordinary movements of a building that had remembered something about itself. Scarlett rose to her feet. She did not look at the chandeliers, or at the brass plate, or at the long view through the front glass. She looked at the people moving across the floor she had once described as the floor of her company. For the first time, she did not see assets. She saw lives. Power does not make a person larger. It only magnifies the person they already were. And the fastest way to know whether a person has dignity is to watch how they treat someone they believe cannot answer back.